Okay.
Thanks very much for the introduction. When I was asked to come and speak, I said to Graham, well, I don't know what I can say that's really of relevance to the Deep End community. But then Graham encouraged me to come and talk about some of the future challenges that will dominate coming decades and probably centuries, and perhaps some of the implications that will have for health systems. And I think really Julian's ideas and concepts are absolutely relevant to this, because he, after all, as we've heard many times before, urged that we integrate the public health with the clinical perspective, with the primary care clinical perspective, and also that we work in solidarity with deprived communities who are going to be, I think, particularly affected by some of the things I'm going to talk about. It's also very timely because if you look on the BBC website, one of the big stories, as we've heard from Jan already, is that the children are protesting. They're protesting about climate change. They're saying to us, our generation, what have you done? What kind of world have you left us with? And they're every right. You know, we should be supporting them because they're every right to be angry at the indifference of many of the authorities about these burgeoning environmental challenges. So I'm not going to make any apologies, but I'm going to try and give you a very rapid overview of some of the changes that are coming over the horizon. And to start by saying that we're actually living in a new epoch of history, which many people have called the Anthropocene. And it's called the Anthropocene because it's dominated by the activities of one species that most of us have spent our professional lifetimes trying to save the lives of. That's Homo sapiens. Sometimes I wonder whether sapiens is really the right word to describe our species, but I'll leave it at that for the moment. So this slide just summarizes something that's called the Great Acceleration. The Great Acceleration probably, well, people debate when it actually occurred, but it certainly occurred very obviously around the middle of the last century. And on the left, you can see the socioeconomic trends, dramatic increase in world population, over 7 billion people, in gross domestic product, in the consumption of fertilizers, the use of energy, the construction of large dams, and so on and so on. So we have indeed seen real advances in human progress, not sufficient, of course, still dramatic inequalities, but there have been advances overall globally. Life expectancy has increased by about 25 years since the middle of last century. But it's come at a cost. And one of the costs, of course, is that many people have been left behind. So many people have not benefited from the Anthropocene. And also the Earth systems have borne the brunt of all this. So the Earth systems have been undermined in a completely unsustainable way. So that's what the children are protesting against, saying, your generation have exploited these systems to become wealthy, in relative terms, and you're leaving us with less and less. You're undermining the basic life support systems that we, this coming generations, will need to live by. So this slide, I think, illustrates some of the changes that have occurred. Now, I won't go into all of them, but there have been massive increase in greenhouse gases. Carbon dioxide is at the highest level in the atmosphere for the last 850,000 years. It stays up in the atmosphere for about 1,000 years, or at least 15-20% of it does, so it's a legacy that we're bequeathing future generations. Fisheries are overexploited. We've exploited the maximum amount of land on the planet to try and grow food. And so on, and so on. I could go on and on, but I won't. So where will that take us in the future? Well, this is just one of those variables, and it shows us what will happen. There are two different futures embodied on this slide. This is global average surface temperature change. The top line, the red one, is if we just carry on emitting as we have historically greenhouse gases, and that will take us well over the 2-degree target that was agreed in Paris, possibly up to 4 degrees or more. And then the bottom line is what will happen if we put into place many of the commitments that were made in Paris. Indeed, we exceed those, because at the moment we're somewhere between those two. We're on about 3 degrees warming. And if that happens, that will cause profound transformation of many natural systems around the world. So there are linkages, too, between climate change and many of the current environmental exposures that we're suffering from at the moment. It's become apparent over recent years that air pollution has a dramatic effect on health globally. It causes about 1 in 9 deaths globally, something of that order. Particularly affects low and middle income populations, but we're all affected by it. You know, here at the moment, we're probably respiring air which is above the WHO limits, safe limits, I would imagine. So we're all affected by this problem. And of course, it's very much linked to our exploitation of the environment. So a lot of it comes from energy. Coal is the worst offender of all, of course, but fossil fuels in general, from agriculture. And although poor people don't cause very much greenhouse gas emissions, they do cause some pollution from household energy. So if you go into a house in a low-income country, the first thing that hits you, of course, literally, is the smoke, which is many orders of magnitude greater exposure than we experience in the cities of the north. So there are close interrelationships there. So what implications could climate change have on human health in the future? I've indicated a few of these on this slide. I'm not going to go into them in any detail. I'm sort of going to leave you with the concept that climate change will have many effects, mostly negative. Some people say, well, there might be a few positive, there'll be warmer winters and so on, but overall, the effects will be negative. They'll be increasingly negative, and they will increase inequities in health. And I think this is one of the reasons that Julian, as Mary reminded me just before this talk, one of the things that perturbed him most in the last 10 years was climate change, because for the reasons I've outlined, and because of its potential to have so many adverse effects on health, and increase the inequalities that he spent all of his life really speaking out against. So that gives you, if you like, a kind of panoramic view of some of the health impacts of climate change. And I'll just mention perhaps one or two of them in more detail. Heat, increasing heat stress and other extreme events like floods and droughts. They also have social dimensions, and I think increasingly we need to think about the socio-economic and environmental determinants of health as being integrated and interrelated, which we need to try and tackle at the local level and the global level. And if you're a family doctor, in many parts of the world, your patients are being exposed to unprecedented levels of heat. In France, for example, 2003, this book on fatal isolation documented the epidemiology of those heat-related deaths. Many of them were in poor populations. They were people, isolated, elderly people, living alone in unair-conditioned, the top floors of buildings and apartments where they couldn't even open the windows to cool themselves. And they died alone, often, without anyone attending to them. So those summer temperatures that triggered that massive heat wave will become the norm by 2030. So they will be the kind of average, if you like, of the kind of summers that we can expect. It may not seem like that sitting here in chilly Glasgow, but that's the reality of things that will confront many of our colleagues around the world. As I say, not just heat waves, but also floods, droughts, and other challenges. We also know, and I think this would be something that Julian would have been particularly exercised by, that as you warm the temperature around the world, that decreases the potential to undertake physical labor. I mean, Julian spent all of his working life in a mining community, and miners are, of course, exposed to quite high levels of heat. So you go under the ground, you get poor ventilation, the temperature is relatively homogeneous under the ground. But global physical labor capacity is decreasing in many low and middle income countries. If you tried working, going out, go to a tropical, subtropical country, you try and do any physical exercise outdoors, it's almost impossible. So it's already starting to go down. And on the right, the image you see there is some projections we've just published. The yellow area shows you where it will be almost impossible to work in the hottest month of the year as temperature increases. So by the time you get to about 3 degrees warming, which we could get to by the end of the century, more than 1 billion people will be exposed to those kind of temperatures where it'd be almost impossible to work. So if you're a subsistence farmer, you can't just say, well, I'll take a month off, I'll come back in a month and pick up my salary. For a poor person who's living hand to mouth, that is going to be massively disruptive and also hazardous to health. Also, climate change is going to affect food production. The red area shows you where crop productivity is going to decline, and the green area where it may increase by mid-century. That's largely the temperate regions. After mid-century, it may decline even in temperate regions. And you can see that in many cases it overlaps with the global hunger index. But we can't be complacent. Even a country like the UK, particularly after Brexit, if we can't import our fruit and vegetables from Europe, where are we going to get them from?